Complex South Research Network, I welcome you all to today's session. Thank you all for joining in. My name is Sandeep Menon. I am a landscape architect and also a member of the Complex South Network. A little bit about Complex South Network before we go into the main talk for today. Complex South was founded as a collective to critically engage with decolonial scholarship and understand the researcher dynamics in urban transformations across the global South. Our challenge is to understand the complexities in both the global South as well as the global North. Our network is intentionally interdisciplinary, and our intention is to deepen this understanding of the unique challenges and complexities that our cities are facing today. As we know, cities function in a very, very different manner in the global North versus the global South. Our cities are layered, they are interconnected systems which are constantly negotiated in practice. And nowhere is this more evident than in informal settlements, where infrastructure, governance, and everyday life intersect in extremely complex ways. And that exactly is the topic for today. It's practicing urban complexity, the city as a negotiated system and not a planned outcome. Our guest for today is Dr. Barsha Puricha. It's a real pleasure to introduce Dr. Puricha, whose work sits at the intersection of urban development, governance, gender, and community empowerment. With over 3 decades of experience in urban community development, she has consistently focused on strengthening democratic participation in underserved urban contexts and enabled more inclusive community led decision making. She's trained in sociology, social security, and urban and regional planning. Dr. Puricha brings a distinctly multidisciplinary perspective to her work. She has previously served as a program director at the National Foundation for India, where she supported grassroots organizations through strategic grant making and capacity building. She is currently the director technical for the Center for Urban and Regional Excellence, where she continues to work closely with civil society to co create nuanced, locally grounded solutions to urban challenges. Alongside this, Barsha is also deeply engaged in planning pedagogy as a guest faculty member at the School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi. We are delighted to have you with us today, Barsha, and we look forward to your insights. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandeep, and good afternoon and good evening from whichever part of the world that you all have joined in. And thank you so much for this opportunity, both Binti and Sandeep and Complex South. Um, the subject is particularly interesting for me because a little bit about myself, in the sense Sandeep has, um, of course, shared exaggerated introduction. But for the last 30 years, in the sense I complete 30 years of my professional life this year, and I have been kind of um, working, struggling with ideas of urban informality and particularly, as Sandeep mentioned, intersections between gender, lived realities, and of course, a dignified life in urban areas. So today's conversation is going to be a conversation. So what I'm going to do is I'll just share some of my experiences as to how do people actually make the city and how does the city actually make them. So city as a negotiated space and not as a very structured, planned, uh, built infrastructure. So how does the built form actually interact with lived reality of a human, and how does a human actually communicate with that built form is something that we'll discuss today. So it's going to be largely built around some of my experiences, and I think I'll speak for about 20-25 minutes or something, about half an hour, and then I'd like to hear more and interact more on the understandings that all of us have about this largely complex urban space. So thank you again. And with that, um, I begin because I come from India, and we've been speaking about urbanization and urbanism. So one of the things that India has is a very, very complex urbanization system. So cities over here, historically some of the cities have come up as planned cities, some have not. People living here come from various parts. There is inter and intra migration. There are shifts. So primarily what one has seen is that urban systems and urban change is a non-linear framework. And that's one of the arguments that I'm going to stay with throughout this particular session, where there is formal and there is informal, as we like to say. What is not formal becomes informal, but these two kind of juxtapositions actually uh, kind of interweave themselves within each other, and that's how the city gets formed. So one of the aspects that we are going to touch upon over here, and my site today is going to be primarily Delhi, though I've been working across the country. But today, I'm going to pick up some of these informal sites from Delhi and share how this negotiated space actually comes in, and how this non-linear pattern actually brings in some form of identity and legitimacy to the people's lives. So the three kinds of idea anchoring that one has, and particularly because urbanism, if one has to speak about it, is actually it's actually a political ecological environment. And why do I say that? Because cities come up on a notional high value of land. Land is a limited resource, land is highly valued, so there is a continuous context, there is a continuous contestation of the space that people have to live by. And that is why cities become very complex. They are adaptive because there are human beings who are living in it and continuously kind of influencing the structures around them, and they're continuously negotiating for a space, for their identity, for the right. And informal settlements, which is the primary anchor for my session today, is actually the lived reality of this urbanization. So if you actually get into any kind of an urban complex or urban system in this country, you have to look at the informal sector, which actually forms nearly about 60 to 70% of people and of built form in any particular city in the country. And we have this word called slums, which again, it's a bureaucratic term which comes up, where you have about 60% of the city which lives in informality, but from that there are about there's about 20% which is actually recognized by the state, by the nation state, or by the city as slums. So these are also, they are recognized sometimes as illegal. The entire contestation is around the legality, and we've had many experiences over the last particularly 30-40 years when some slums have shown themselves as being non-static, non-linear movements, and where people have actually contested for for their legality and their legitimacy in the city. So there are three very interesting, and this is, of course, as I'm saying, this is based on my understanding and my experiences of the last so many years of having worked in this particular setup, and that is around the micropolitics of urbanization. So urbanization has a macro politics, and that's one understands that there are policy schemes, there are governments which get formed, and that also influences the kind of urban agendas that cities and states have. But there is a micro politics of urbanization, particularly from the informal sector. And the three segments that I believe has a lot of influence on the kind of urbanism that we are looking at is, the first is this, it used to be called the patron client relationship, which is the broker and the intermediary. So the slums are actually not homogeneous. We call them communities, but they are one of the most heterogeneous communities that you'll actually see in a urban setup. And there is a relationship, there is a contestation not only with the larger macro politics, but there is a contestation which is happening right within that slum. And there is a broker who's trying to broker their their dignity, who's trying to broker getting in some of these services into the slum communities, and also acts as an intermediary between the slum settlers and the people who are in the decision making process to be able to provide those services. For example, if we are looking at urbanism, you do have the entire elected representatives, you do have a system of governance which works, you have city governments which are there. So this particular broker is the one who actually, the slum, it's not that all residents have access to this larger macro politics. It is the broker or the person who's kind of self-appointed as the intermediary between these people, because that's how the negotiations work. So that's something which is prevalent. And that's one of the reasons why I bring it over here, is that urbanism is complex, and unless we start breaking them up into some of these categories, we will never be able to understand these nuances of how it works. And therefore urban planning will always be a kind of a challenging process, rather than being something that people can actually use to make their lives more efficient. The second is politics of patience. The slum dwellers are extremely patient people. They're smart, they understand how to go about it. So they are not actually the informal settlements, particularly the cases that I'll pick up in Delhi. And I'll kind of delve into all of these through examples of lived realities of today. But there's also politics and of patience, and I think Professor Appadurai actually brings it out in a lot of his scholarship, where he says that people wait. So today, if there is a negotiation that needs to happen, they do not work on systems of revolution. They do not do they are not impetuous in their decisions. They wait it out. If there is an eviction which needs to happen, if they've heard that it has to happen, they wait it out. They know that waiting, then trying to build in that negotiated space using the broker and the intermediary to do a conversation might buy them more time and legitimize the space. So it's a very interesting pattern that emerges, particularly in urban settlements, about this entire thing of waiting and watching, rather than being impetuous in their discussions and trying to become adversarial to the government. The third, something that is coming up, and particularly this is something that I have started engaging with much more than I used to do earlier, and particularly in the last 2 decades, one has seen this entire understanding of this micropolitics of gender. When I say gender, it's actually the entire the particularly because the non-profit sector, the civil society organizations have been working, and also the government have been working around this entire women's agenda, and trying to look at gender and development, and trying to bring in women in a decision making process where actually the structural inequity is kind of managed and understood. So the gender politics is also micro politics, as I call it, is also coming up in a strong manner in the informal settlements, which turns out to be very interesting. When I start sharing some of these examples, starts becomes very interesting, because you have the broker and the intermediary, who till now has been a very strong man. Could be a man with a lot of wisdom, could be one of the oldest human beings, could be somebody with a lot of status. But today, with the women's group, and how do women actually start collectivizing, and how are they trying to negotiate their own space within the slum settlement, and also with the decision makers, to be able to ensure what, just taps and toilets which are accessible to them, just so that they are not they are able to have an access to a sanitation system which is safe, which is dignified. They can send their children to school. So the demands of the asks are very limited in this particular scenario, but there is a very interesting politics which emerges. um, so this is a little bit about the organization that I'm engaged with, and with whom I've been working for a long period of time. And the some of the examples that we have over here comes out from my engagement with this. So I work, as Sandeep has already mentioned, as Director Technical for Center for Urban and Regional Excellence. This is based in India, in Delhi. And this is an organization which is now about 2 decades old, 25 years old actually. And we the we got together as urbanists, architects, and planners, primarily to reimagine, innovate, de-engineer, and unthink this urban space. So when we came in, it was 2025, so it's 2026 now, so it was early 2000s. We already had the liberalization and globalization frameworks coming in. We already had the UN MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, that was thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals. But we also realized that in a country like India, we were looking at migration, we were looking at people coming in into cities, we were looking at informal settlements growing by the day. So we needed to do something on the field, and that's how Cure, I think, came up. I joined much later, but Cure came up. And the idea was to create an equal or a co-equal system of interfacing between people who are in the quote unquote informal space with the formal systems of decision making, and trying to connect the dots to be able to integrate within the infrastructure of the city so that some of their basic services, some of their civic needs, some of their dignity is returned back to them. So essentially, we follow an ecological integrational approach to development. You can take a look at our website and you'll find details about what we do. But some of the, we kind of, because once you enter into an informal settlement, you cannot go with a very, very fixed agenda. So there are lots of intersectionalities which are happening in that space right there. So we work across sectors of livelihoods, health, ecological restoration, and all of that. Primarily, what we do is we are participatory fanatics. So we work around the participatory approach. We've developed a very interesting participatory learning by design tool. We've been developing participatory tools for decision makers, for people, as to how do you engage. What is this quote unquote one of the most used words in the dictionary of urban agendas? The entire thing about participation. Who participates? The entire thing is, if you're not on the table, you'll be a part of the menu. For example, if you're not a part of the decision making process, then I'm sure you'll be one of those who has to face the impact of the process. So how do you get people to start talking to each other? How do you get them to start understanding? And as I've said earlier also, that urbanization is a complex process. Communities are not homogeneous. So how do you collectivize people? Where do they come in from? What is that common agenda that they'll start talking about? So some of that we do through our participatory networks, and our impact is across 16 states and 40 cities. So coming back to the subject of the day is uh, slums of Delhi, right? So that's a Delhi map for people who are not from Delhi. And you will see that Delhi has grown, expanded exponentially in the last 40 years. And if you kind of look at those purple dots, those are the slum populations, or Jhuggi Jhopri clusters, as they're called in India. And if you'll see that the last purple dots in the outer concentric circle used to be the periphery of Delhi, and this has now become the central of Delhi. So Delhi has grown in a way which has now brought in the slums, which actually settle down in the peripheries of Delhi into the center part of Delhi. And that's where the contestation actually begins, with the informal settlements and the slum dwellers and the people living around it. So we have a government body called the DUSIB, which is the Delhi Urban Shelter Improvement Board, and this is as far as 2022 enumeration goes, that there were about 675 Jhuggi Jhopris or slums in Delhi. But recent records easily say that there are about, out of 10 people who are residing in Delhi, at least 2 live in slums, and there would be another 4 or 5 who would be living in slum-like conditions or informalities, which are not called slums, but they would be something similar to that. So that's what Delhi looks like. And it has also been a city of migration. One of the reasons why slum housing has come up, and all of us understand this, is because when people have come in over here for whatever reasons, whether it's aspiration, whether it's education, health, or whatever it is, when they've come in, they've not found housing which was reasonable enough, which was affordable enough, which was safe enough. So one of the things that they did was this: they lived in these shanties, and slowly these shanties have become slums, some slum settlements. And in a lot of cases, as I'll show, they've also got some form of legitimacy, in the sense there is no security of tenure, but they know that because they've been able to get some taps and toilets close by, that they'll at least not be evicted soon enough. So that helps them to actually start building the houses in a more pakka fashion, but they are still in a slum settlements. And as all of us know, they're also in the most fragile geography. So even though they might be at the heart of a city, but they will be in fragile geographies of either being near a channel of wastewater, or near a railway platform, or a railway line, or in a depression within that high net worth society. So that's how it happens. And some of the statistics, and this of course goes back to 2011, we're just going to have a census next year. Till then, as planners, we use the 2011 data. So nearly 50% of Delhi's population is were migrants, and that's how, and we believe that that still continues. And there are about 3.5 lakh migrants every year which get added to Delhi. So why am I talking about this? This is also a way that informalities keep growing in a city. And if we have to actually work around urban planning and get some kind of a planning structure, these are certain things that one needs to look at. Well, then I'll come to some of these experiences from my work. So this is a typical slum, right? So some of you have not been to a slum. This is right there, and some of you familiar with Delhi. This is in RK Puram, not very far from the political hub of Delhi. And this is in a depression area, which is near a very government. This is in a government locality called RK Puram, which houses all the government houses in Delhi. And this is a society this is a locality which has been there for the last 35 years. They came up in early 1990s, and they've been residing there. Primarily, they are all waste pickers. So they are the people who actually help to clear up Delhi, make it look beautiful. They are the ones who collect the waste from the houses. They are the ones who sort it out. They are the ones who go through that entire process of making the city clean, but they are not counted. So they are invisible in the city's eyes, and that's how they continue to live in the slum. And this is right next to a drain where, when we started working as Cure over there, this is about 3 4 years back, this used to be the drain, and this was the waste which was flowing in. Because they were rag pickers, a lot of waste used to come in. So what happened was that when we started interacting with the communities, one of the things that came up very strongly was that this drain is something that, and particularly because we engage with women, one of the things that comes up is that this is a drain that can we work around it. This is a space that we've been living in for about 30 years. We understand it's bad. We've been trying to go, and every time there is an election around the corner, there is a person who comes in to get our votes. We talk to him or her about this, but somehow this doesn't go anywhere. And how do we as a collective actually start working around this drain? So when Cure started working, as I said, maybe that's the impetus that an informal settlement also requires, is to how do you collectivize and how do you start understanding what are those negotiating spaces where you can actually go and speak to these people, and how do you become more informed to be able to have those communications with people in decision making. So we started this process. I'm not going to get into the details of it, which I can do later in a conversation, but it took us about a year and a half to be able to get the group together, to be able to get the information together. And finally we were able to at least get an embankment around the drain. We were able to clean it, and we were able to get people start feeling some form of ownership for this particular settlement that they've been staying for 35 years. And because they were waste pickers, the voice of they are actually the most marginalized population right there. So the voice of these people was most difficult and most feeble in many ways. So what one is trying to say through this is that to be able to create that space of negotiation requires a lot of back end effort, and this back end effort has to come through these intersectional disciplines, where we need to go and understand the realities of these lives, of the people's lives, and see how we can make sense of it and take it to the next step. So this is again Hanuman camp. So the other thing that came up, children, right? So children are a very integral part of anything that you do. And as planners, I remember having studied this about 30 years back, that if you build for a child, you build for everybody. So we engage a lot with children. We try to understand what is it that they need to go through, what is it that they're expecting, what is. So one of the things that you have in a slum settlement, and particularly in Delhi, you do have a lot of parks which are now there in resident in societies which are a little upmarket, or at a stage which is a little beyond the slum settlement. But what do you do for children over here? So what was created is, there was this particular courtyard, and this courtyard was kind of empty, and there was a broker who had some form of access onto this courtyard to make it into a parking bay for his vehicles. So it took us a lot of time. The women actually thought through it. The children made a lot of drawings, wanted to make this courtyard into a space where they could start playing. They could have a space where women could come out and start talking, make it a safe space. But all that I'm trying to say is, all of this doesn't happen as easily as it should. Even though the space was been there, it took us, we had to go to the junior engineer, the people had to go to the junior engineer, get permission to be able to do something like this, get the entire masonry together, and finally build a space which helps them, at least in that particular moment of time, to live a little more dignified and a decent life than they were living earlier. So that's one of the stories from Hanuman camp, and I'll weave all of this together. This is another, it's also Ambedkar camp, very close again for people in Delhi. It's right next to the Vasant Vihar malls that we have. And this is a settlement of about 100 people. And this settlement again came into a lot of conversation because they are next to a water channel which actually flows into the Yamuna. Yamuna needs to be cleaned. Yamuna has been a part of our government's big agenda of trying to make Yamuna cleaner. So this particular settlement was kind of trying to was figuring in a lot of discussions as to how does the waste which comes out from this particular settlement and flow into the channel uh, become a more happen become a little more cleaner, so that the water flow into Yamuna then becomes better. So one of the things while doing it is this particular dumping site, which was there because people did not have access to. There is no vehicle which comes in to collect their waste. So this used to be a dumping site and had not got cleaned for a long period of time. So one of the ways, it's just I'm trying to just share with you how difficult it is, even if you have a good intention of trying to build a space which will make it less of a dumping site and make it a conversational space. We ran from pillar to post with the people, trying to just ensure that we have a recreational ground or a playground for people. And we went to multiple, and as you know, Delhi has multiple parastatal and departments. So the conversations went around the development authorities, the horticulture department, the junior engineers, but everybody said that very good idea, you should do it, but unfortunately we cannot give it to you in anything in writing. So finally, in a conversation which happens, and when women went, when they asked for the space, so it was kind of verbally assured that nothing would happen and they could kind of clean up this space. The JCB was also sent by the government to be able to clean up this dumping ground. So this has now become a little kind of a playground, but there are no written notes around it. So it is something which has functioned, which has worked only through a negotiation process. And today, in fact, the local government has also assured that they'll be able to hand us over certain dustbins to be so that people can use that to put in their solid waste, so that that gets carried away and this playground remains like a playground. So even though the decision of the government is also to lessen the dumping sites and to clean up those places, the process of a city planning is a very cumbersome, challenging, and requires a lot of paperwork. So that is something that when you're looking at informalities and how do you create those spaces for them is something that needs to be kept in the process. So this is just a process of the kind of activities that one has to do to kind of ensure this. This is a very interesting story. This is again a Safeda camp. It came up in 1970s. They were struggling, and I think some of you might remember we had this very horrific act of a gang rape which happened sometime in 2007, early 2010 or 2012. It was called the Nirbhaya rape case. And after that, there were a lot of slums which actually wanted toilets at home for their daughters. Fathers wanted toilets at home for their daughters and for their wives. So they wanted a safe space. So Safeda happened, and very quickly, I'll not take too much of your time, but very quickly, what happened was that they wanted there was a sewer network which was running right in front of the camp. So all that Cure did was support this particular community to make a sewer line, a shallow sewer line, which could get connected to the integrated infrastructure. Again, a very engaging process. But this is about 10-12 years old now. But once this sewer line came into process, the lives that you see on the right changed. It became a concrete road which the people made. Once the sewer lines were in place, the individual household toilets came there. This became a road. There were livelihoods. Women come out on this particular narrow alley, which you say from the left. That's how it got converted to the right. They do the livelihoods have increased. The upgrading of the houses has happened. So one of the things that we understand is if you provide taps and toilets at home, one of the things that people do is because livelihoods also increase, they are able to upgrade their home into a more decent house. So the incomes have increased, and it is after 12 years that we went back recently, of course, about 3-4 months back, we went back to this particular community, and the incomes have increased by 10 times. The lives are much better. Children are going to school. But those are stories that you hear everywhere. But this is something that we've actually gone through in this particular. I think this will be my last example of negotiating space. This is, of course, as I was mentioning, this is the Barapula channel drain. Again, a process where we try to we try to kind of engage in with the community and the local government to be able to ensure that this particular channel which goes into the Yamuna becomes cleaner. So these are the pictures that you see. So it was again, and once you are able to negotiate for this particular right, the people start owning up that space. You'll find that houses become better. There is a voice which comes in, and in this particular, for example, as I was mentioning, the gendered micropolitics, the women have now, there used to be a sarpanch over here, somebody who's actually a self-appointed broker on an intermediary for the slum settlement, but the women have now come forward. There is a conversation which is ongoing. The voice of women through livelihood activities has become much more firmer, and they are the ones who are now able to actually have these conversations with local decision makers. The local member of the legislative assembly or the political member who comes into the settlements right before elections, they are able to engage with that person in a much more strategic manner, so that their lives then become somewhat better. So one couple of things that one understood, and some of these takeaways is what I'll share and end with my conversation, is that urban systems have to work from the margins, right? We are looking at about 70% of the population which is in either in informal employment or living in informal settlements. So who counts and what works? So unless you start counting these people, unless you start engaging with these people, urban governance or urbanism or urban planning will always remain as a disconnect between what's happening in the lives of people. So co-production and hybrid governance is one of the things that works very well. And this may not work in a place like Delhi, but we've seen in other places, smaller towns, where this form of a citizen engagement and working with the local decision maker has been able to convert their lives into lives of dignity. Uh, Informality is, of course, there, but through these negotiated spaces, when a Seva camp starts getting biodigester to clean up its stormwater channel, or a Hanuman camp actually gets a courtyard, there is some form. This legitimacy is not a clear legitimacy, but there is some form of recognition both by the engineers and decision makers in the local area to be able to understand that this is a settlement which is there. And if we are to look at a cleaner environment, we need to ensure that the entire area is kind of in a better position. And these are people who understand, they are the ones who are actually contributing to the GDP of the city. So these are certain services which may not come formally, but this also provides some form of legitimacy to their identity and their rights. The third, of course, that infrastructure is a system trigger. Once you actually integrate them or provide them with some form of infrastructure, and we've also come to realize that public infrastructure has to be publicly funded, as in it has to be the government or the local decision maker who has to take care of this public infrastructure. But the moment you integrate, for example, in Safeda, when we integrated, it was a system trigger. The houses became better. There was a better living environment. The girls started feeling much more safer. There was an individual household toilet. They are now, in fact, they've built a floor above, and they're able to rent out that space because Safeda is also next to a industrial hub. So there is a lot of migration which is in migration which is happening, and they're able to earn their money through this particular space that they have. The fourth, of course, is all about non-linearity. I've been speaking about this. Urbanism is complex, it is a web like thing, and we need to recognize it, that it cannot be a templated form of urbanizing. We will have to recognize that it is non-linear. Some places some things work, other places it doesn't, but we will need to look at co-production. We will need to engage with people on the ground and try to understand how do we recalibrate this urban practice. So we need to move beyond urban planning. We will need to enable systems and not just deliver projects. There are projects, there are schemes of the government which are there, but we will also need to enable this entire ecosystem of designing, of development, of co-production, co-creating, in which I think this intersectionality, interdisciplinarity comes in a lot, becomes a very, very integral part of this recalibration of this urban practice that we're looking at. Um, some of the reflection that we have is that the state is very much present. Informality is not because the state is absent in those places. The state is very much present and it governs, but it governs through an ambiguity that works for both the system and for the city. But all that we are trying to say is now we need to bring in that citizenship that is actually there, because when there is an election, these are the people who actually go out to vote. There are protests, there are everyday negotiations happening. So citizenship is happening on the ground, and it could not be taken for granted, but it requires, possibly, in my understanding, I could be wrong, and I'd be happy to be to see the other side of the spectrum too. But if once the citizenship is performed and is understood and appreciated, the complexity of the urban space then starts becoming a little more clearer. Urban space, third, is it is produced incrementally. It does not happen through one development plan. It does not happen. You might have a 2041 development plan, but there are a lot of these spaces within the city which actually work around these small acts, these small negotiation of spaces, which then become a part of the city. So, for example, all these slums that I spoke about, they came in 1970s, right? 1970 was a very integral year for India. We had a lot of protests, we had a lot of movements. People migrated in search of better aspects. There was agrarian economy was kind of becoming a little more challenging. So people wanted to move towards these spaces, and they went when they came to Delhi. This was in 1970s. So they've been living in that informality, in that aspect of ambiguity for the last 45 years, but they've been performing a task for the city. So there is value in bringing all this together and trying to work around them. So just leaving you with a couple of thoughts that cities have to be understood through these small connected interventions. Let's not look at linear planning. Let's not look at very structured template-based planning. Pedagogy needs to change. Pedagogy needs to understand the chaoticness, the messiness of this particular mammoth subject that we are dealing with, and that basic services become a very, very important part of the transformation of lives of people. And these taps and toilets, and I've been kind of harping for a very long time that taps and toilets become a very integral part of the lives that you're trying to imagine or reimagine in the city. And unless they're provided at home, unless urban planning also changes, and unless we move away from those benchmarks of community toilets and community taps, stand posts, and start looking at unthink ourselves and start looking at integrating systems and providing taps and toilets at home, we will be looking at similar kind of conversations even after 20 years. So that's it from my side. I think I'll take a pause over here, and I'd be happy to have conversations if there are any, and to clarify any discussions that might be